do the first part, pose some questions, and hopefully have some dialogue among the panel. Let me first pose a question to either Alan or Douglas. I mean, how realistic do you think are the prospects that the British Parliament would fundamentally change your libel law, and to what extent passing a strong federal statute here would facilitate that? Something that fundamentally reshapes the balance.
Well, I'll take that as we've been somewhat involved already in the process. The fundamental problem at the moment with such a piece of legislation is the balance, as I alluded to, between privacy and issues of things like libel tourism. There's a huge fear in Parliament, and probably this is actually occasioned by the fact that MPs themselves would probably be under the scrutiny most by this, that if you relaxed libel laws in some way, that they would feel the force of the media. We do have particularly aggressive media. It's really quite unpleasant compared to continental Europe and the USA in particular, where really politicians here get off very, very lightly indeed. The sort of reverence that's accorded on television and in the print is just extraordinary here. I mean, US senators, for example, wouldn't last 2 minutes in the British political system. So they wouldn't. I mean, it's just, you know...
Could be a good thing.
It could be a good thing, but my point is, I think pressure from the US would actually be a tremendous embarrassment to British legislators to do something, but I think fundamentally it's about that balance. That's
one point, and I promise not, since I'm probably the only lawyer in this panel, not to make it too legalistic, but have you all considered walling off the genuinely domestic issues? And the way to look at it would be to sort of, and there's lots of examples in the law, what is the real focal point? Where is the center of gravity of alleged offense? If Fleet Street publishes something, it's one thing. If a Wall Street Journal publishes something, but it's, you know, you can buy, well, Wall Street Journal is a bad example because of Wall Street Journal Europe, but let's say you can get at something through the web. That's a totally different issue. So you can deal with libel tourism in a way that does not fundamentally change the domestic balance. Have you all pondered this?
I agree with that, because in fact in that debate in Parliament in December that I alluded to, Brooke and I actually were working with Dennis McShane, who was a lead member bringing it about. He started off very much in the position of, well, hold on, we've got to be very careful here because of the privacy aspects, but by indeed focusing on that very aspect of libel tourism, we bumped that up, and both he and his two fellow MPs, Michael Gove and Norman Lamb, took that issue, and I'm pleased to say that was a heavy part of the debate that then was filed into the Select Committee stage that's just about to finish, and I think will be pushed forward again. I think that's a clear division. If you can look at the origin, look at who's disseminating, what the issue is as well, I think there are grounds for hope on that, and I think actually people are waking up to the possibility that you can change the law on that.
All right, let me maybe ask you or Douglas or whoever else the question. To what extent can you really fix this, given the nature of the EU these days? To what extent can you fix it at the national level in Europe? Because you got, I'm not an expert in EU law, but you got directives, you got European legislation. Is it really possible to do it, or is it more of a pan-European fight?
In my estimate, well, personally I sort of kind of regard the EU Parliament as well like sort of ghosts. I just don't believe in it.
Well, you got the Commission, but it's quite busy.
I mean, there is evidence to the contrary, as I say, large buildings in Strasbourg and Brussels. But I mean, the EU is a monstrosity. No good can come of it. It's like so many things. You know, the best thing could just simply for it to be raised to the ground and don't start again. The problem we have in Britain now is that, I mean, quite simply, if you say you're a voter in Scotland, you go to your local MP and you say, I've got a problem with XYZ law, and your MP says, that's not me you've got to come to. I think the MEP can do that. And the MEP says, no, I'm the MSP, you're one. The MSP says, no, possibly local councillor. Nobody knows who's in charge of anything. You have so many layers of government that none of them are responsible. You have so many layers of government that nobody knows who's governing. And Europe is the prime culprit in this. Now, since we signed the Human Rights Act, anything can be booted up into that. Anything at all comes under one of those European Human Rights Act clauses. And I'm sorry, I mean, I'm not a politician. I don't need or seek votes or approval. All I can say is that from my point of view, until the EU is wrecked, nothing can happen. And
No,
all I would say in
no
a positive
applause.
way is that,
No
all I would
applause.
say in a positive way is that may be possible. It's overextended its reach so much that I think European citizens are going to realise this at some point and are going to revolt.
Please, no applause. We'll be accused of being a hateful audience. But go ahead, Elizabeth.
First, David, you're not the only lawyer on the panel, I confess. I, too, am a lawyer.
Oh, all right.
Oh, sorry. I, too, am a lawyer.
Thank you.
And not only that, I loved law school so much that after my JD, I went back and got a master's in international and European law. So I just love the law. But to answer your question about efforts in the, at the domestic level in Europe to deal with the issue of lawfare, the UK actually has made significant strides in the area of libel tourism. Within the past few years, there's a case called Jamil v. Wall Street Journal. It, to my knowledge, is one of the few cases where the defendant fought back and actually won. One of the reasons it possibly could be is that the Wall Street Journal has significant resources, finances to be able to defend itself during a long and protracted legal battle in a UK court. But they did, and actually after that win, after that victory, it's been said that the UK is sort of moving in the direction of making its defamation laws more, I guess, similar to American defamation statutes, where it's not less plaintiff-friendly, but more enabling for the defendant to actually have its day in court. So at that domestic level in the UK, it definitely is taking place, but they certainly have a long way to go in terms of dealing with libel tourism as an issue.
Actually, I have one follow-up question for Elizabeth. I'm not naive about the ways of the UN. I once suffered for 3 years. Fortunately, it was only 2 weeks at a time being the U.S. representative to the charmingly entitled UN Subcommission on Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. So I understand, but I'm curious, has anybody ever considered using the logic of the resolution to numerous anti-Semitic and, well, let's forget about anti-Israeli, but pretty clear anti-Semitic statements that emanate over time in the UN Forum, because they're quite plentiful.
Well, I mean, who are you asking?
Elizabeth and you, Barak.
So the question is
Well, I mean, has anybody, again, sometimes if you cannot win, join them, just like we heard about sort of turning the weapon against people at the national level. Has anybody tried, are there any NGOs at all at the UN level that get up and, you know, there's a period of time allocated for the NGOs to speak and basically say, look, on the language of what you're pushing, the following, you know, delegations or following individuals have just defamed Judaism, defamed, you know, is it at all usefal? Well,
They have. I mean, the Humanist Association, the Center for World Jewish Education, two people in particular at the UN Human Rights Council, I think of David Lippman and Roy Brown, have been for years tackling this at the UN. And they state again and again in front of this farcical body that for the OIC to be pushing through anything on blasphemy is a false antithesis being presented, because the first people who should and would be prosecuted would be them. And they have pointed this out for years, and to, I'm sorry to say, very little effect inside the institution, which, because of the nature of the United Nations, I'm sorry, I sound like just a wrecker of institutions today, but because of the nature of the United Nations and the OIC's block voting there, you simply can't get any traction on this. It can't be emphasized enough. Playing it on those terms is like being sent out onto a tennis court and being given a hockey stick to play with, and just being told, well, this is the game, you've got to play it, whatever you've got to hand. Again, no good can come from it.
Go ahead, Barak.
At a more fundamental level, I would say NGOs care about, which is where they proliferate at the UN level, they care about soft power issues. If ever they deal with hard power issues, they speak about nuclear disarmament. They don't speak about countering nuclear proliferation or counter-terrorism or democratization. It will be on soft power issues, which are also really important. But, you know, it's framed in order to achieve the Millennium Development Goals of the UN. So they're going to be about women's rights, development issues, the environment. They're not going to be about issues that are manifestations of hard security issues. which are, for example, anti-Semitism is one of them. Anti-Semitism is often wielded by those that seek to undermine Israel's national security interests. We haven't seen, when we have, for example, Jewish organizations that operate at a UN level, when they have some sort of UN status, they tend to be Jewish organizations countering anti-Semitism and defamation in general, but they don't, but we have to reconfigure ourselves in order to achieve what you're speaking about, to be effective and advance issues at a UN level, at a multilateral level, and change our remit, perhaps change our titles, change our framings, that we are framing ourselves in, concurring with soft power issues such as development, the environment, human rights, and we have to in that terminology, and we have to get NGO status in order to affect change at these multilateral levels. Because as of yet, I would suspect, it's not I'm going to say, but I would suspect that there are not many conservative organizations that are operating as such.
That's true.
Can I quick? You can't win it. You cannot win the game because the game has been made by your opponents.
Well, I understand we have to change the rules, but in the interim, one is we'll push back. Go ahead, David.
Well, consistent with the confessional spirit of this, I have to come out of the closet, as they say, and admit that I'm a lawyer myself. But also, I reassure my panel members that in the spirit of the zeitgeist of this panel, I'm in therapy. A point I would like to make before the panel ends has to do with the blasphemy issue, the Organization of Islamic Conference, and a few other themes. We have very understandably become galvanized, those of us who are awake to this, to what is going on in relation to possible treaties and formal agreements and so on that might ultimately be imposed upon us by this kind of juggernaut that we're seeing fronted by the United Nations and fellow travelers. One of the grave difficulties we face that few people realize, especially those who imagine that because they're living in a country that tends to respect free speech, they will not have these things imposed upon them, is the concept of customary international law. Now, and I see lawyers, I can tell who the lawyers are, especially with any international exposure, because the heads are nodding. This is really, really important. You do not have to sign formal agreements and all the rest to have the writ of this kind of initiative run internationally as international law, because if enough countries embrace the kinds of values and principles and laws that may be comprehended by this notion of blasphemy law, then it becomes a part of the customary international law system. And individual countries will thereupon have to face a very difficult series of choices. Will they want to go against international law? Or will they do, quotes, the right thing and begin to ensure that those international values, those values of customary international law, are represented within the corpus of their own law and legislation? This is a real challenge, and this is why we have to cut it off as soon as possible. And there is a related issue I'll quickly go into, and that is that I understand that certain United Nations bodies are completely without the knowledge, probably of anybody in this room, periodically sending the equivalent of questionnaires out to national governments and bureaucracies saying, we are all trying to fight this phobia and that phobia, religious sensibilities and so on. Can you tell us what your government has done to fight against this? And so all of the premises are simply assumed. There is no kind of national debate or discourse about the appropriateness of acceding to the assumptions that are implicit in these kinds of UN questions and so on. And so your bureaucrats can start racing around trying almost to manufacture solutions to things that may or may not be problems in the first place, but that above all are not getting vetted and discussed fully in the country.
Thank you, David. Excellent discussion. Let's switch to questions from audience. Please identify yourself, indicate to whom you pose your question, and be as brief as possible. Yes. Actually, you may want to come forward, save time. in advance. Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add something, because today we have been talking about how radical Islam is not about Islam. The radical Islam have been using the law, or the lack of the law, as an ally to silence people, or to push for its goals here in the West. And I just wanted to add something more to it, a little.
Very briefly.
Yeah, I wanted to tell. In England, I remember in the 80s, I saw Kalim Sadeghi, a subject of the Queen. He had a parliament, Islamic parliament, paid by the Iranian government, that for me is the Islam fundamentalist by excellence, and he had. I went to Switzerland, I saw the Muslim Brotherhood leaders with neo-Nazis, the leader of neo-Nazi, Ahmed Hoover, they had the bank at Taqwa. I came to United States, and the gentleman who sued me, and they work for the Iranian government, I believe, they are Zoroastrian, the head of them is Zoroastrian. And last year when Ahmadinejad came to New York, he was hosted by 300 members of the American peace movement. He took a reward from them. And the day before, he was hosted by 5 religious groups, none of them Muslims. I mean, the law, or the lack of the law as an ally for the Iranian regime, as an Islamist government, but it has its own allies too. I wanted to add a political note to it, that they have their own allies in the West. We should not forcefully to look for the Hezbollah or Hamasi or Kale only. They have more than that. That was my
Thank you.
addition.
Questions?
Hi, Paula Schrieffer with Freedom House, a US-based NGO. Actually, we do quite a bit of work on this issue of freedom of expression, defamation, libel. I'm curious, we have struggled, I would say, here in the States to gain any media attention outside of very conservative media, which of course jump at the chance to criticize anything related to the UN or anything related to radical Islam. Part of it, although, is also because Americans, of course, don't feel themselves so immediately challenged by this issue, but I think it's a real mistake. I'm curious if it is a bit different in Europe, and to what level these kinds of issues are getting any kind of attention in the press, particularly press that is not considered, far-right press in Europe. I'd be very curious.
Yes, very little. It's the same as it is here. When Arms for Jihad, the book that Cambridge University Press pulped on the orders of Mahfouz, before even asking their authors if they had the evidence to back up what they'd written, before they'd even asked the authors, they pulped the book. When Cambridge University Press took this brave decision, the response in the British press was tiny, absolutely tiny. And I think that one of the reasons why it comes to that, very briefly, is that if you went to the British press and you said that a neo-Nazi or a Nazi or something had threatened something, they'd get it. They'd understand what you were talking about. Bad guys. They haven't quite landed on that realization with some of this, and there are two primary reasons from different political sides. One is that from the left-wing presses, to use these sort of now rather tired and I think unhelpful labels, but the left-wing press, still seems to believe this is actually about aggrieved ethnic minority complaints, which may well be right. And on the conservative side, there remain enough people who think that actually this whole debate is about good manners. And if we could just be more polite and decent to each other, it would all be fine. I remember Lord Dacre, the late Hugh Trevor Roper, or Lord Faker, as he was known after authenticating the Hitler diaries. Lord Dacre said, of course, during the Rushdie affair, he said it wouldn't be a bad thing if Salman was taken down an alleyway and taught some manners by some young Muslims. That's the conservative speaking for you. So everyone gets it wrong in their own way.
Not to interrupt the flow, but I'm curious, does Freedom House consider maybe ranking countries based upon the way some other NGOs do, based upon the way in which they protect or not protect First Amendment values?
Well, I think Freedom House invented ranking countries, actually. But we do a press freedom survey and an internet freedom survey now, where we look at many of these issues, and we have whole methodologies that provide numerical rankings as to how countries are
For
doing.
libel tourism, too?
Libel tourism isn't a specific thing that we've come out ranking on, but we've done some joint work, for instance, with Article 19, which is a terrific organization based in the UK that has focused on this. So it would be something to look at. But we do have numbers, for instance, on OIC's records on freedom of expression and freedom of belief compared to other, say, actual geographic regions, which are interesting and telling. But I just want to say, I think it is a mistake to pose this issue as a conservative issue. This is a fundamental human rights issue, and I think we all need to work very hard to get all human rights organizations on all sides of the table to be focused on this issue together. And there are left of center groups as well, Freedom House is very middle, that do care about this issue.
Okay, may I add one point to this? You're absolutely right. I do think there needs to be a constellation of different NGOs from across the political spectrum around the term human rights, around, greater transparency for the UN, whatever. But the problem is, and I will, for simplicity's sake, distinguish between conservative and liberal organizations. Often conservatives they lack style and have substance, and the reverse is for liberals. And I'll tell you why. I'm boring. I read books. So there's so many books that are written about mismanagement in the UN, right, by Dory Gold, Joshua Moravchik, John Bolton, Jean Kirkpatrick. That doesn't trickle down into the greater and broader cultural milieu, right? Similarly, as Douglas said beforehand, we ought to perhaps also start, issuing legal writs against people who we just don't like, right? So on a stylistic level, I think that those that care about the issue of lawfare have failed.
Well,
I'm not sure, by the way, when Barak last saw a lefty, but I'm not sure they do have style.
all right,
No.
Ellen,
Yes,
two seconds. And
just
then
quickly on the media issue. What Douglas says is broadly correct. On lawfare, it's certainly the case that people aren't interested. But there are chinks of light in terms of attitudes towards what extreme Muslims have been protesting about. I'll give you one example. Recently, you may have seen this ridiculous case. British troops came back from Iraq, arrive in Luton to be greeted by radical Muslims, saying, baby killers, we're going to kill you, etc. And the response was dramatic, actually, led by mainly the jingoistic press on the lower end of the market, so not the sort of, the high end that Douglas obviously reads, but the sort of...
I only write for the low end.
Right, well, that's better, they pay better, I'm sure. But the point is that those papers do have an interest in promoting matters like that and saying these are values issues, we are not taking this kind of approach to our troops and things like that. So when the line is crossed in that way, I think we have more chance of seeing change in the media.
let me take one question from this side now. Go back.
Hi, my name is Shelley Dolphin. I'm an attorney here in DC. So yes, I'm a lawyer. And I also have a master's, but I got my master's in human rights as an American right-of-center person in England. So I've kind of been battered about myself. I just wanted to comment first, the comment about the Westphalian system, and what I've learned in studying human rights and working in it is that it's not just the goal to undermine the system of these groups, it's the overarching goal of internationalists to undermine the system. And so I think we need to not forget that. But when you look at the laws that have been passed in the last 10 years, particularly in Europe, that discuss hate speech and hate crimes, they're clearly in contravention of the most basic fundamental rights of the ICCPR and the Human Rights Declaration. And in a legal and political society where basically the citizens of Europe, from what I could tell from my time there, have just given up. They've submitted to what's going on and feel like they have no voice. How do we get them, what essentially can we do to spur them to action?
Well, any takers?
Lawyers?
Lawyers. No, and let me just add to that. I mean, isn't part of a problem the sort of a widespread decline in the attractiveness of religion? It's very difficult for a totally secular society to battle any kind of movement that is enormously devout. I mean, whether you like or dislike the religion involved, religion is enormously powerful motivator. So it's a...
I don't think that's the case at all. I think that's nonsense. It isn't at all difficult for secular societies. It isn't at all difficult for secular societies to combat religious extremism. I mean, first and foremost, because we don't like the look of it. Liberal in the genuine sense of the term societies have a rather potent way of reacting toward Islamic extremism, which is as follows, is that you get them on side when you alert them to the fact that it's perfectly possible that their liberalism, in the good sense, might well be a mono-generational phenomenon. That what they've enjoyed might not outlast their lifetimes, might not get to their children and not their grandchildren. When they realize that, you don't need to claim rival holy books on your side. You don't need that. The people of Holland, for instance, who are not a particularly religious society, have realized that increasingly in recent years, and it's in that that I'd put my hope before trying to evangelize my country.
Well, I'm not going to get into a long debate in the interest of time, but one of the problems is that if you're fairly secular, you tend to underestimate the potent force of religion, because you just, especially if you're an upper class person, you may think that this is sort of for the masses, and you're not as clear. In some sense, if you're threatened with revival of Nazism or communism, you are more alert to that threat. But anyway, we can talk about it offline.
Can I just say...
let me give David a chance. Go
well, I was going to agree with your nonsense and suggest that when you,
Thank you.
As an individual, find yourself in a cosmic reality that is alien from the cosmic reality in which someone who perhaps aspires to escalate and accelerate the coming of Armageddon, it may be rather difficult for you to relate to that person and to understand what moves them and how you approach them. And hence, I think you have a good many exceptionally well-meaning people who are typical products of our society who, when faced with this kind of creation, this worldview, find themselves thinking, well, let's just talk. Right. Because I'm projecting some level of rationality upon the other.
All right.
I just want to say, based on what you just said before, on the question that you said, I think it is worth revisiting the whole issue of lawfare and maybe perhaps reframe it that it's not simply an issue of freedom of speech, which is symptomatic, but on a causal level is about defending our Westphalian state system. Secondly, the way one counters the phenomenon that we see, one of the ways that lawfare is able to increase its momentum is that these people are they're grassroots. The civil society movement is a whole grassroots issue, which means that power has diffused. For example, look at the blogosphere, right? Each individual has a voice that is much greater, it's amplified, and that was never the case. Once upon a time, once every couple of years, you went to a ballot box, or you would speak in your social gathering. Now, your voice is amplified, so you're not an individual, you're an entity, right? Each individual is now an entity, and as such, we ought to consider countering it in the same NGO manner, and in the same type of constellations in which they operate.
Okay, one more question from this side. Now all right, sorry, go ahead. I'll get to you.
Thank you. My name is Leo Adler. I'm a lawyer from Canada, and I also teach international criminal law at one of the law schools there. It seems to me that we have to remember that the concept of these types of lawsuits began with NGOs and organizations going against neo-Nazis and racists and so on. And so the weapon is the weapon that, as Professor Dershowitz said today, is always, always a two-edged one. And the question really is, what is it that we're supposed to be fighting in these libel lawfares? And I say that because in Canada, we don't have the same freedom of speech as there is in the United States. Our charter begins with a declaration that democracies must have limitations which can be justified under certain circumstances, and that's the basis of the Human Rights Commissions and our hate speech laws and so on. So I think that what has to firstly be done, and it's nice to see such an international array over here, is a common, not an American imposed standard of what is freedom of speech, but a common standard of freedom of speech based on the fact that we're democracies, but we're different democracies. And the other thing is that as long as we're going down the road of protecting and standing up against individuals for these types of libel lawsuits, I think we also need it for criminal, on the criminal side, to prevent the charges and to defend those who are going to be facing criminal charges in the international
Let me maybe tackle it briefly, and I certainly don't want to sound jingoistic because I'm an American lawyer and a First Amendment aficionado. My law firm does a lot of media work. It seems to me that to state the obvious, we of course have an enormously protective paradigm for speech with very, very few exceptions, and I'm quite familiar with the litigation legacy against KKK and various other neo-Nazis, but we of course make a robust distinction between speech and conduct, and speech outside of, very narrow range of circumstances is not actionable. I understand that's not the Canadian paradigm, it's not the European paradigm. The problem we have, frankly, I would have been very happy to sort of protect our system and let Canadians do what they wish, but we have this unfortunate globalization where things are really pushing at each other, and whatever your view about incorporation of customary international law, we have no choice now but to push aggressively, it seems to me, our paradigm, at least it'd be displaced eventually. So in some sense, there's a tendency to homogenize, and to me, if you believe it, your own paradigm is the right one, and I do think we balance liberty and other aspects of democracy and freedom of speech correctly. We have no choice, because if we just try to protect it here, between libel tourism and all the other things, and the tendency of American courts to increasingly look at the views of foreign courts and international law, which we don't like, but it's a fact. What choice do we have? It's really a struggle for sort of a legal soul of mankind, not to sound too grandiloquent. But there's...
Well, just on the Canadian front, this is a fair and reasonable rendering, naturally enough, of the Canadian Constitution and its uniqueness relative, at least, to the United States. But my question would be, based upon the evidence that has now been, as we may say, adduced here before you, I am far from convinced that we are, in Canada, indeed remaining true to what might be described as the Canadian paradigm. That is the problem.
And I'm not standing up either for or against. All I'm saying is that it seems to me that the greater challenge that we face it requires an agreement or some kind of an understanding among the democracies of what is freedom of speech, to have some kind of a line so as to be able to properly deal with what is an international problem.
The UN Charter, maybe?
No, absolutely not.
I think that, I understand your question, and I think that scenario would be an ideal or utopian one even. The problem is, though, that even amongst Western countries, every country's laws on defamation are different. Many countries don't even have a codified free speech tradition. There's no First Amendment in the UK. And
We didn't have it until 25 to 27 years ago.
well, so that only reinforces the point that there, all the Western countries, that I assume those ones you're talking about, have varying traditions at varying levels based on their social and cultural and historic experiences. I mean, ideally it would be nice for everyone to get together, but I think very much in the United States it has a very robust free speech tradition established in case law precedent that we wouldn't be very easy to give up. And I don't know if I would necessarily agree or disagree with Professor Dershowitz's comments this morning that we should go out and evangelize our First Amendment to the rest of the world, but I think that it would be very challenging. I mean, it would be nice if the countries could get together and agree to certain terms, but I don't think the United States would ever, let's say, agree to the terms of the UK in terms of its defamation statutes. And even Professor Dershowitz's case in Italy that he was talking about briefly this morning, he was able to be sued there because the criminal defamation statutes are so different to the protections that we have here in the United States. So, I mean, maybe we can come to agreement on certain terms of various things, but an absolute uniform standard made
one point, though, and I don't agree with Professor Dershowitz on many issues, but it's not entirely an academic issue because it's being played out in the context of a very serious geopolitical struggle. I would just invite you to reflect briefly how successful it would have been in the Cold War, which after all, was not just a war decided by economic and military foreign policy competition, but the battle of ideas, which eventually proved out a bankruptcy of Marxist ideology so much so that you probably had more Marxists on American campuses than in the Soviet Union. If we were handicapped by the lawfare practiced on behalf of a communist party, where you could not write about what was happening in Soviet labor camps, so you could not write about the excesses of Soviet psychiatric hospitals. It would have been quite unfortunate. I'm not prepared to say would have lost it, but would have been a very different play. And we are, at least in my view, engaged in a serious war. So the need to be proselytizing our tradition, I think, is more compelling now than maybe 20 years ago. And we're not going to succeed 100%, but I'm very much concerned by the nexus between the free speech paradigm and the battle with radical Islam.
Here we go.
Yeah, sorry. We can.
Hi, my name is Nicole. First of all, I'd just like to say that I've never felt my heart beat this fast before, ever. And I just graduated college from the University of Miami about a year ago. And I used to be very idealistic. And then I went away. I was in Strasbourg, I was in Brussels, I was in Geneva. I spoke to people who work for the EU and the United Nations, and everybody, every single person that I spoke to just isn't happy about their job. They don't feel like they've made a difference in their life, which is sad. And I used to be idealistic, and now, especially in this economy, and graduating and facing student loans, I've become extremely realistic, and it's terrible. It makes me feel really, really bad. And Mr. Murray, specifically you, I mean, you just shot down the EU, you shot down the UN, and I'd like to know if there's any hope, or what can I do? Seriously, what can I do? And not just me, people, kids my age who just graduated from the university, and instead of hearing, excuse my language, wise-ass comments like, if you're not a Marxist at 18, you have no heart, and if you're still a Marxist at 25, you're an idiot.
I've
been hearing about problems and problems and problems, just no solutions. And you know what? I actually thought an NGO, working for an NGO could have been a solution, but you pretty much shot that down for me too.
All right.
A solution is to take antidepressants. That might work.
Okay. We don't have much.
You can sort of break through the depression, I find, and then it just becomes funny again. I'm sorry. The world is as it is. I just make the following observations, if I may. Which is, first of all, the lie that's been told to your generation, mine, if I may say so, that such benighted, wonderful, haloed institutions could persist for all time. I think this is a great myth. A generation has been brought up on a set of fallacies which have started to come crashing down, and I think not before time. They always were going to. We've lived in a rather, I think, unreal period. How to get succor from this? Well, first of all, to wave that period goodbye strikes me as already being a positive and happy-making start. But to go on from that, we wouldn't do badly just to reassert and to find solace again in the things that got us to the periods in our societies when we were thriving. And just this links to the previous question. I know that lawyers tend to see every problem as having a legal solution. I think to a lot of this it isn't a legal solution. There is actually an educational solution to a lot of this. I meet more and more people in America, my country, and in Europe, who young people who simply don't understand the tradition, actually the English tradition of freedom of speech. They've never heard of Milton's Areopagitica or John Stuart Mill on liberty. They don't understand that just because something's mean and nasty doesn't mean you can ban it. They don't understand that you have to hear wrong opinions in order to arrive at right ones. They don't realize that if you stop Mr. Irving telling his lies about the Holocaust today and shove him in prison, it might not be a stopping of anti-Semitism, but a continuation of it. You might observe that Austria, which did nothing to denazify and gave us Kurt Waldheim, then puts in some late laws to try to prosecute an English historian for what he might say. This has been a fatuous period, and we could get out of it faster if we, as I say, relied on the things, again, that got us the liberties which we've enjoyed, which we took to a breaking point which they could never have sustained, and realized that there are better things in life than going off to build NGOs in various countries. There are more real ways to make a difference. We sort of live in a period where the sort of idea of the Good Samaritan. I mean, if the Good Samaritan thing happened in your society, my society today, if there were the person starving beside you, you'd go off and start an NGO to help people in Africa, but not actually do anything for the guy there. I mean, we live in a society, as Ed P. J. O'Rourke said once, everyone wants to save the world, but nobody will help mum do the dishes. You start from the home, start from your neighbours. If you can't brighten up your neighbour's day, chances are you're not going to be able to do all that much for the people of Rwanda. It's time to get real on this and limit our expectations a tad. But I don't think it means we have to be gloomy.
Well, to steal a slogan from a well-known NGO, think globally, act locally. No, I'm kidding, but the answer is there are many things you can do by yourself and your family and with your friends. It does not have to be all channeled in those new sort of exalted expressions of social will. But anyway, we can talk.
Can I just now,
later.
Douglas Murray, destroyer of dreams, crusher of hopes, murderer of kittens and puppy dogs.
Here.
No, on a serious note, Nicole, I have two suggestions. Firstly, have you tried alcohol?
Irony also. Irony, I find.
No, but on a serious note.
No drug suggestions.
No drug suggestions. A lot of the answers are actually in this room. If you look around you here today, you've got lawyers who are committed to reforming the legal system. They are working in their profession to make those changes that will make a real difference in the world. Journalists who will highlight the abuses that will force governments to act. Aspiring politicians who will go into parliaments and look to do those things. Organisers of think tanks who campaign on these issues. The people are here. You can be one of those people as well. It doesn't have to be in the sort of conventional sense of go to the UN, go through that system. Maybe look to reform that system from the outside, look at the people in this room as an example, and see if you can contribute that way.
I'd like to just add, even a layperson...
We're out of time. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I very much apologize. Sorry. All right. Forgive me. Please, go ahead, sir. I stand chastised.
Okay. I hope you get over it soon.
Peace be on you all. My name is Daud Ahmed Hanif, Imam of the Ahmadiyya Muslims in the USA, and I am Masters in Islam. I want to point out towards the blasphemy law. This blasphemy law, which is promoted by Pakistan and being propagated all over the world now, it is, in actual sense, it will destroy the human rights in due course. The reality is that we, as Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan, we have been declared as not Muslims. We believe in the same prophet, we believe in the same book, we practice the same thing, but for the purpose of law, we have been declared that. And we even cannot pose as a Muslim without the threat of being imprisoned. So this law is not an honor to the Prophet. It is a slur on the face of the Prophet and all prophets. The freedom of speech, freedom of practice has been always promulgated by the prophets and by God himself. So if God does not promulgate such laws in his books, why the people should introduce those laws to destroy human rights? So I will ask you, all the right-minded people, to oppose such laws wherever they are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, panelists. We are at the end of the day today. I, by the way, am Dean Reuter. I'm the director of the practice groups of the Federalist Society. I will be extremely brief here in closing our conference, but I do want to provide something of a recap of the day's events. Brooke Goldstein began our day setting the table for the day's discussions by describing libel terrorism. a type of forum shopping that seeks jurisdictions with less robust free speech rights and protections, making certain speakers defend their actions in expensive legal proceedings. And I know that's a bit of a redundancy. We began with the assumption that there are no longer any inexpensive legal proceedings. We then heard a morning panel, yes, we then heard a morning panel begin our discussions in earnest, debating whether libel terrorism is a problem, the extent of the problem, and possible remedies. There were differences of opinion, to be sure, on the extent of the problem, its actors, and best solutions. We looked carefully, trying to discern where one's rights to publish and speak, another's right to learn and read, and still another's right to privacy and reputation begin and end. We examined how best to balance the various and often conflicting interests of the jurisdictions and actors involved. And we fairly resolved that we could do with a full-day conference to shine a light on Sharia-compliant finance. At lunch, we were treated to 3 moving testimonials recounting the stories of 3 individuals who have been defendants in what they described as nuisance suits designed to silence their critiques. In closing our conference, we broadened the topic geographically, taking our focus to an international level. We learned again that life is not all puppies and butterflies. We were left with plenty to think about here today. We've heard sharp disagreements between and among our panelists and spirited probing questions from you, the audience. We have perhaps raised more questions than we have resolved. Nevertheless, I believe and hope you believe that this has been time well spent. Now, the principals and many of the speakers of today's event will be remaining on site after we finish here today to take your questions and continue the discussion. But I want to thank you all for attending, and for now we are adjourned.